So here we are, on the precipice of yet another year. Hopefully fully recharged, and after a restful period, we are ready to get back amongst the chaos that is our businesses and professional lives. Something that really became apparent to me at the end of last year was this sense of ground rush. It's a great expression here. Ground rush is, I believe, a skydiving term, but essentially in this case, it means that things start to happen more quickly the closer you get to an event. So essentially at the end of last year, many of my clients and individuals that I knew started to experience this ground rush, this sense of ground rush, as they hurtled towards closing their businesses down for the year. Now, what occurred to me is that during these periods of intensive work, regardless if we're talking about a small operation or a huge corporate business, the frequency of the meetings always seems to increase. And in most cases, this is probably an understatement, as I know many individuals bear witness to their calendars bulging at the seams and exploding through the sheer volume of meetings being penciled in by their line managers or peers and colleagues. Anyway, we digress. The fact is, many professionals sharpen their language skills continually through apps, personal tutors, online platforms, and podcasts such as this, which is all fantastic news. Yet, we are all in training for something. Now, training, this could be for a daily conversation. You're taking language classes to brush up your skills, ready for that daily conversation, or in preparation for limited interactions at home or when you're traveling for business or pleasure. This extra practice with your language ability and developing your language ability gives you that edge, that confidence to operate. These are all great examples of what would be, I guess, a good sparring session in the gym. One where you can use the skills and techniques you've learned in an environment that is normally fairly straightforward. However, what occurred to me in those moments last year is that many professionals were actually not in the gym, so to speak, having these short, sharp interactions during this period of intensive meetings. They just weren't in that sort of controlled environment. They were, for all intents and purposes, in the gladiatorial arena as they were being bounced from one meeting to another, from a physical one to a digital one, from offline to online, from being a participant in these meetings to leading it, to actually fronting up and spearheading that meeting. The environment which many professionals face isn't straightforward at all. There are multiple levels of complexity, including, but not limited to, several conversations happening at the same time, or dynamic and ever-changing agendas throughout the course of a meeting. There's formalities to consider, who sat in the room, and so much more. Essentially, meetings have become the battleground for business English learners. They can be fast, confusing, and without the correct terminology, your participation and credibility can be short-lived, it has to be said. Now, if this sounds like you, or if this rings a bell in some way for you, then we have got a great series coming up for you. In this next series of episodes, we're going to be talking about advanced business English phrases for meetings, and today we are going to kick off this series with how to get a meeting started. So, without further ado, and a hell of an intro, here's the music. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Business English Podcast, helping professionals communicate more effectively, more confidently, and with impact. With your host, Rob. From Energetic English, let's get down to business. So, as we've already said, this episode is going to be laser focused on the advanced English phrases we can use to start a meeting. Now, admittedly, we have already done an episode on meaningful meetings just a couple of episodes ago. However, this series of episodes is specifically designed to focus your attention on the three main elements of a meeting, in addition to providing a number of advanced business English phrases for you to use at each stage. So stick around to the end of the episode, where all will be revealed. Now, as I mentioned during the intro, there are, more often than not, just two positions which you may occupy when in a meeting. You are either leading it or you are attending it, with potentially some participation at points throughout it. We will, of course, consider phrases for both these types of roles as we move through the episode. Now, regardless of what type of role you'll fulfill at any particular meeting, there are just two things that we need to concern ourselves with at the beginning of any meeting. That is, who's in the room and exactly what's involved. With this simple two-part segmentation, we can now put our phrases into two distinct pots: introductions and agenda. Now, it's safe to say that regardless of the type of meeting you're attending and the role that you'll fulfill at it, the start of the meeting will be made up of these two key components, which we will take a look at in just a minute, right after doing the thing we must do right at the very beginning of every meeting: the welcome. So let's take a look at a couple of phrases that help us welcome attendees to a meeting. Okay, so you've called a meeting and people are flying down the corridors or loading up into the Zoom rooms, the waiting rooms, the Google Meets, waiting for entry, or maybe they're sat in the room already. As is traditional on the Business English podcast, I will go through the phrases twice, then leave a little bit of a gap if you want to repeat them back to yourself out loud or just in your head, or make a note of them somewhere in your phone or on a notepad or on a whiteboard if you're taking these sessions seriously. So here we go. First up, a couple of expressions, two in actual fact, that are slightly more formal in nature. Remember what we said at the start of this episode regarding the formality of a meeting, actually being conscious of who is in the room. Are there any senior members of staff, perhaps line managers, the VP, the CEO, could be anybody. So these first two phrases will be more formal in nature, but not too much. So first up, first I'd like to welcome you all. First I'd like to welcome you all. I would like to thank you for being here. I would like to thank you for being here. Now, the next phrase here is if you have ambushed the attendees, so to speak. And what I mean by this is the type of meeting that is called at the very last minute and you literally have to drop everything in order to attend. These types of meetings are perhaps more frequent than we all would like. However, here is a phrase for welcoming attendees to this notorious type of meeting. I wish to thank you all for attending at such short notice. I wish to thank you all for attending at such short notice. And finally, two phrases for informally welcoming your attendees to a meeting. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate everyone being here. I appreciate everyone being here. Okay, so with these phrases, you will be more than adequately equipped to welcome your attendees or victims to your meeting. Right, let's move on to the next step in starting a meeting, which is the introductions. Okay, with everybody sufficiently welcomed to the meeting, we can now turn our attention to introducing the members around the table, or the virtual table in some respects. Firstly, I'd like to highlight two expressions that will help us initiate introductions around the table. The first one being slightly more formal than the latter. Okay, here we go. Could everyone please briefly introduce themselves? Could everyone please briefly introduce themselves? And now for the slightly more informal phrase. Let's take a moment and introduce ourselves. Let's take a moment and introduce ourselves. The reason for this second phrase being slightly more informal is the fact it is less direct. You're not specifically asking the attendees of the meeting to introduce themselves. You are merely hinting that this is what's about to happen. Okay, let's move on to directly introducing somebody at the table or in the meeting itself. For example, you're not going around the table and having each individual introduce themselves. In this case, we're now going to introduce specific members of the meeting. Now, there could be a number of reasons for this. It could be a visitor to the business or company, a special guest, a new member of the team, etc. So, here are three phrases. The first one. I would like to introduce Mr. X. I would like to introduce Mr. X. I would like to begin by introducing Mr. X. I would like to begin by introducing Mr. X. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. X. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mr. X. Now, I've used Mr. X to illustrate the individual being introduced, although now I'm thinking about it, Mr. X or Dr. X was always the bad guy on TV. But I hope you get the idea. And of course, during the introductions part of the start of a meeting, you will more than likely be asked to introduce yourself. Now, I've covered this on a previous episode of the Business English podcast. However, a very brief reminder, this is as simple as, hi, I'm Rob from the English department. Hi, I'm Rob and I work in the English department. Listing who you are and what you do is all that is required at this stage. Now, with the introductions out of the way, we can now move on to looking at the agenda and exactly what's involved in this meeting. Now, of course, I'm sure it goes without saying that any steely-eyed leader of a meeting should lay out not only the agenda, but the objective or goal of the meeting too. This helps pull the meeting into shape and give it some direction. So firstly, a couple of phrases to outline our goals for the meeting or our specific objective or output for the meeting. Note, this is not anything to do with the agenda itself. We'll come on to that in just a second, but chronologically, when you're holding a meeting, should really give it some direction first and then discuss how you're going to achieve that objective, i.e. the agenda. So, here are a number of phrases to outline your goal or output for a meeting. Today, we are going to. The purpose of today's meeting is. I've scheduled this meeting so that we. By the end of today's meeting, we need to. We are here today to agree on. We are here today to agree on. Our aim today is to. Our aim today is to. If you're worried about the formality or informality of any of these phrases, please don't. The majority of these, if not all, can be used interchangeably regardless of who sat in the room. Now, with our goal for the meeting outlined, we can now move on to the agenda. As we all know, the agenda is normally distributed ahead of time if you're attending a meeting. However, on the rare occasion that we are notified of a last-minute meeting, we still may have the opportunity to get eyes on an agenda once we arrive at the meeting. The point here being is that you will be describing something that the attendees of the meeting can see. If you're running the meeting, you will need a number of phrases that accurately and smoothly moves the attention of the attendees through the agenda. To do this, we can use the following phrases. To begin, we will be discussing. To begin, we will be discussing. Next, we will consider. Next, we will consider. Shortly after that, we'll go through. Shortly after that, we'll go through. Then we'll cover. Then we'll cover. After that, we'll move on to. After that, we'll move on to. And if we're still okay for time, we'll look at. And if we're still okay for time, we'll look at. And lastly, we'll talk about. And lastly, we'll talk about. And finally, summing up with. And finally, summing up with. Now, as previously stated, these phrases just help you describe to the attendees what's happening at each stage as you move through the agenda. Now, as promised at the beginning of this episode, we're now going to take a deeper dive down the rabbit hole and explore some more advanced business English phrases for, well, let's face it, some more advanced business scenarios. The scenarios in question are being late to a meeting, only attending half a meeting or a small portion of the meeting, standing in for someone at a meeting, and raising important news. One, if not all of these scenarios are fairly commonplace at most meetings. So it would be remiss of us here at the Business English podcast to ignore these important components of almost every meeting. So let's have a look at some advanced business English phrases to articulate each scenario. First up, and it happens to us all, we are occasionally late. In this scenario, you can only apologise. So, here is a formal way of apologising for your tardiness. My apologies for not being here on time. I was only made aware of this a few moments ago. Apologies for not being here on time. I was only made aware of this a few moments ago. And now to informal phrases. My apologies for keeping you waiting. My apologies for keeping you waiting. Sorry I'm late. I was tied up with. Sorry I'm late. I was tied up with. These phrases are short and to the point, allowing you to press on with the rest of the meeting. Now, sometimes the meeting or last minute meeting isn't the only thing in our diary. In some cases, we may only be able to attend a portion of that meeting. Raising awareness to this and outlining it at the beginning of the meeting is good practice. So here are a couple of expressions that you can use to manage expectations. Firstly, a couple of formal ones. Just to make you aware, I will need to leave at. Just to make you aware, I'll need to leave at. I'm afraid I'll only be able to attend half of this as I. I'm afraid I'll only be able to attend half of this as I. And now to informal expressions. The first one is digital for an online meeting, and the second one is for a physical meeting. Firstly, digital. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to jump off the call at. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to jump off the call at. Now physical. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to nip out briefly at. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to nip out briefly at. Like we've said, attending half a meeting can't be avoided sometimes, so it's best to manage those expectations from the get-go. Use these phrases to do exactly that. So, I don't know about you, but on the odd occasion, I've actually had to turn up to a meeting that has been organised by somebody else and run it. This is known as standing in. I was standing in for them at their meeting. Now, a couple of phrases that you could use in this scenario are, I'll be standing in for Rob today. I'll be standing in for Rob today. Rob sends his apologies for not being here today. Rob sends his apologies for not being here today. Rob won't be able to make it today, so I'll be chairing the meeting. Rob won't be able to make it today, so I'll be chairing the meeting. With these phrases, you can clearly and concisely illustrate to the attendees at the meeting that you will be leading the meeting in place of somebody else. And last, but by no means least, is the subject of important news. Often at the start of a meeting, before delving into the nitty-gritty details of the agenda, the individual leading the meeting may need to highlight a number of pieces of important news. Now, you can use the following two phrases to do this. Before continuing, I want to make you all aware that. Before continuing, I want to make you all aware that. Before jumping in, I just want to highlight. Before jumping in, I just want to highlight. Using these phrases at the start of a meeting will help draw the attention of the attendees and put whatever you're saying into lights, neatly addressing the issue before getting going with the rest of the meeting. And with that, it brings us neatly to the end of this first episode of 3 on advanced business English phrases for meetings. In this episode, we have looked specifically at the start of the meeting, the phrases required to kick off a meeting in the correct manner, before turning our attention to those 4 areas that we may need to address at the start of the meeting. Once again, they were if you're late, if you're only attending half the meeting, if you're standing in for someone, and if you have any important news to raise before jumping in to the meat of the meeting. And I will leave you with this. Using these phrases will enable you to kick off your meeting with the correct feel and momentum that will set conditions, hopefully, for success in the rest of the meeting. You've been listening to the Business English Podcast. Leave a review and let us know what you think. And we'll see you next time.